Christmas was my favorite time of the year. Always had been. It wasn't just the presents or the food, though those were nice. It was the whole vibe. The snow, the decorations, the feeling of excitement that seemed to bubble in the air. And this year was shaping up to be just as magical as ever. 1 week before Christmas, I was busy helping my mom decorate the house. The living room smelled of pine and cinnamon, the scent of the tree mingling with the candles she insisted on lighting. Ellie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a box of ornaments. She was humming along to a Christmas playlist, her usual teenage snarkiness replaced by something almost cheerful. Even Dad, who usually grumbled about all the holiday fuss, was outside stringing up lights on the porch. "Make sure the angel goes on top," Mom called from the kitchen, where she was baking what had to be the 4th batch of cookies that week. "I know, Mom. We do this every year," I said, rolling my eyes. But I couldn't help smiling. There was something comforting about the routine, about knowing exactly how things would go. Grandpa and Grandma weren't arriving until Christmas Eve, but we'd already set up the guest room for them. Their suitcases would barely be unpacked before Grandma started fussing over the turkey, and Grandpa claimed his usual spot in the armchair. It was predictable, and I loved it. That evening, as the snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes, we all gathered in the living room. The tree was finally done, and Ellie had managed to convince us to watch some cheesy Christmas movie. It was one of those nights that made you feel like everything in the world was exactly as it should be. Christmas was always special for my family. Every year, without fail, my parents, my younger sister Ellie, my grandparents and I would gather at our old snow-covered house in Vermont for Christmas Day. This year was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. The morning had started perfectly, the kind of Christmas morning you'd see in a Hallmark movie. The living room smelled of pine from the enormous Christmas tree Ellie and I had decorated the night before. It was still dark when I woke up, but the soft glow of the tree lights bathed the room in a warm, magical hue. Snow fell steadily outside, adding to the postcard-perfect scenery, while the fireplace crackled and filled the house with its comforting warmth. After breakfast, we all settled into the living room. Ellie was flipping through channels on the TV, trying to find something everyone could agree on. She finally stopped on a news report that made us all freeze in place. "Breaking news," the reporter said, with a grim but steady voice. "Authorities have reported a string of gruesome murders occurring in the surrounding areas of Vermont. The killer, who appears to target families celebrating Christmas, has left behind scenes of horror, victims found with their organs meticulously removed. Law enforcement is advising everyone to stay indoors and ensure all doors and windows are locked." Grandma clicked her tongue, shaking her head. What kind of monster does such a thing? On Christmas, no less. "Probably some sick prank," Dad said, though he looked uneasy. Ellie turned off the TV. "Well, that's festive," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the room was palpable. We all tried to move on from the unsettling news, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Something about the details made it feel too close to home, too real. Mom was already in the kitchen by the time I came downstairs, humming Silent Night as she worked on her famous cinnamon rolls. The aroma of sugar, cinnamon, and butter drifted through the air, making my mouth water before I even saw the tray. Ellie was curled up on the couch in her Christmas pajamas, half watching some classic holiday movie while scrolling through her phone. She'd never admit it, but she loved this time of year as much as I did. Grandpa was in his favorite armchair, puffing on his pipe as he read a book, his usual old man routine. Grandma, of course, was working on another one of her infamously itchy Christmas sweaters. She'd already forced me to try mine on earlier in the week, and my neck was still recovering from the scratchiness. Dad, who usually buried himself in work even on weekends, was actually sitting by the window with a mug of coffee, chatting with Grandpa about football and watching the snow pile up on the driveway. Breakfast came and went, and the living room buzzed with excitement as we started unwrapping gifts. Laughter echoed off the walls as Ellie opened a gag gift, a ridiculous Santa hat with built-in lights, and immediately put it on, making us all laugh. The day felt almost too good to be true, the kind of joy you'd bottle up if you could. It wasn't until later that things started to change. After lunch, we settled into a slower rhythm. Grandpa and Dad were still chatting, and Grandma had taken up her knitting again, but Ellie had started drifting off on the couch, forgetting about the movie. The light outside had dimmed. A sign that evening was approaching. As the shadows stretched across the living room, the cozy atmosphere began to feel oddly heavy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Then the doorbell rang. The sound broke the peaceful quiet like a crack of thunder, and we all paused. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to stop by with holiday treats, but something about the timing, or maybe the heavy echoing sound of it, set me on edge. Grandma glanced toward the door with a furrowed brow. "Who could that be?" she asked, with a curious but a little wary voice. "I'll get it," I said, pushing myself up from the couch and brushing off the faint unease creeping up my spine. After all, it was Christmas Day. What could possibly go wrong? As I approached the door, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine. The doorbell rang again, the sound sharp and impatient this time. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking it. I opened the door, and a gust of cold air hit me, sending a shiver through my body. Standing there was a tall man dressed in a Santa suit, with his figure looming against the swirling snow. He held a large, shiny red gift bag in one hand. At first glance, he looked festive enough, but as my eyes adjusted, something about him seemed wrong. His suit was just a little too crisp, too perfect. His face was mostly obscured by the white beard and hat, but his eyes were what set my nerves alight. They were cold and unblinking, devoid of any warmth or joy. "Merry Christmas," he boomed with a deep and overly cheerful voice. It echoed strangely, as if it didn't quite belong to him. Thanks," I managed to say, with a faltering voice. "Special delivery," he continued, thrusting the bag into my hands with surprising force. "This is for the whole family." "Who's it from?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding. "Why, Santa Claus, of course," he replied, laughing. It wasn't a jolly laugh, though. It was sharp and mechanical, like someone trying to mimic a laugh they didn't understand. Before I could say anything else, he turned abruptly and walked away. His were boots crunching in the snow. I watched him until his figure disappeared into the darkness, the snow swallowing him whole. I closed the door quickly with my hands trembling slightly as I held the bag. The house felt quieter than before, the warmth of the fireplace suddenly less comforting. "What's that?" Ellie asked, already bounding over. She didn't wait for an answer before tearing into the bag like a child on Christmas morning. Inside were 6 small boxes, each one perfectly wrapped in shiny red and gold paper. Each box had a neat little tag, with one of our names written on it in elegant cursive. "Creepy but cool," Ellie said, grinning as she handed out the boxes. I noticed how she didn't seem fazed by the stranger, but I couldn't shake the image of his eyes. I took my box and sat down, examining it carefully. It felt heavier than I expected, and there was a faint metallic smell wafting from the bag they had come in. It wasn't overpowering, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. "Does anyone else smell that?" I asked, looking around. "Smell what?" Ellie said, already tearing the wrapping off her box. "Nothing," I muttered, forcing myself to laugh it off. But as I held the small box in my hands, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread settling in my chest. After the strange encounter at the door, the family did their best to settle back into the Christmas spirit. Ellie insisted on turning the TV back on, flicking to one of the many Christmas classics to lighten the mood. The Santa Claus played in the background, but no one was really paying attention. Mom returned to the kitchen, clattering around as she prepared the roast for dinner. The comforting smells of rosemary, garlic, and cooking meat began to replace the faint metallic scent lingering in the air. Dad and Grandpa started a game of chess by the fire, with their voices occasionally rising as they debated strategies. Grandma, ever the unflappable matriarch, took out her knitting once again. She sat on the couch, humming softly to herself as the needles clicked rhythmically in her hands. Ellie sat cross-legged on the floor, with her open box in front of her. It contained a small snow globe, intricate and beautiful, with a tiny cabin in the woods encased in swirling snow. Inside the globe, there appeared to be a tiny picture of a person, but it was turned at an odd angle, making it unrecognizable. "Weird gift," she muttered to herself, shaking it and watching the snow fall. I couldn't help but notice how engrossed she seemed in it, almost mesmerized. Grandpa had opened his gift earlier. It was a polished silver pocket watch. "Haven't had one of these since I was a boy," he said, clicking it open and inspecting the intricate details inside. But the hands of the watch were frozen at 10:59, a detail that felt oddly specific. Mom's gift sat beside her on the counter, a pristine cutting board engraved with a delicate floral design. The intricate flowers seemed harmless at first glance, but the precision of the carving left an uneasy impression, almost as if the pattern was waiting to resurface in a darker context. She admired it briefly before setting it aside, too busy with dinner preparations to give it much thought. Dad had unwrapped a sleek, modern camera. "Perfect for family memories," he joked, fiddling with the buttons. When he opened the viewfinder, however, he froze. Inside the camera, there was already one photo. A haunting image of an empty dining table with 6 chairs arranged around it. Each chair was positioned as if waiting for a member of the family to sit down. But the chair at the head of the table, larger than the others, was burned and charred. The blackened wood stood out starkly against the pristine tablecloth. "That's strange," Dad muttered, his tone uneasy as he quickly turned the camera off. "Maybe it's some kind of preloaded display photo." He set the camera down on the coffee table, but his hand lingered over it for a moment. His brow furrowed. Something about the image clearly bothered him, though he tried to shrug it off. Grandma's box revealed a music box, delicately crafted from dark wood. When she opened it, a soft, haunting melody played, a tune none of us recognized, but one that sent a chill through the room. Inside, a small figurine of a woman holding a lantern spun slowly, her face dismembered and uneven as if the sculptor had left it unfinished or had intentionally marred it. The disfigured features added an eerie edge to the gift, making it hard to look away. "How beautiful," Grandma said, though her voice wavered slightly. The lantern the figure held glowed faintly, as if alive, casting tiny flickering shadows on the walls. Something about it felt wrong, but no one said a word. My gift was still unopened, resting on my lap. The box felt heavier than it looked, and I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine every time I thought about opening it. I hesitated, my fingers lingering on the edge of the wrapping paper. "You okay?" Mom's voice startled me. I turned to see her standing there, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face was lined with concern. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound convincing. "Just that guy at the door. He freaked me out a little." Mom gave me a reassuring smile, patting my shoulder. "Probably just some guy trying to be festive. Don't let it ruin your Christmas." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the unease. Something was off, and I knew it wasn't just me. The house felt different. The air felt heavier, like something unseen was watching us. Dinner was served soon after, and the table was filled with laughter and stories as we tried to push the strange events to the back of our minds. The living room was alive with the warm glow of the fireplace. Dinner had just ended, and everyone seemed to settle into that post-meal mood, where the evening stretched comfortably ahead. It was the kind of moment where time felt slower, like the night could last forever. Grandpa sat in his usual armchair, the silver pocket watch he'd unwrapped earlier resting in his lap. He turned it over in his hands, occasionally glancing at the frozen hands on its face. "Quite the craftsmanship," he murmured to no one in particular. Ellie was sprawled out on the rug, shaking her snow globe and watching the tiny flakes swirl around the cabin inside. Her face lit up with childlike wonder as she squinted at the mysterious picture hidden within. "I think there's a person in here," she said, holding it up for Mom to see. Mom, busy arranging her new cutting board on the kitchen counter, only glanced over briefly. "It's a lovely gift," she replied, her voice warm but distracted. She traced her finger over the floral engraving, admiring its detail. Dad fiddled with the camera, his brow furrowing as he looked through the viewfinder. He hadn't touched the strange photo inside since he'd discovered it, but now he seemed to be testing the buttons again. "Can't figure out why this thing won't turn on," he muttered, shaking his head. Grandma, meanwhile, had her music box open on her lap. The haunting melody drifted through the room, soft and repetitive, but with an unsettling quality that no one seemed willing to mention. The figurine of the disfigured woman holding a lantern spun slowly, catching the firelight in odd ways. I sat on the couch, my unopened gift still resting beside me. It felt heavy every time I moved it, like whatever was inside carried a weight beyond its physical presence. "You're not going to open it?" Ellie asked, glancing up from her snow globe. "I will," I said, forcing a smile. "Just enjoying the suspense." Grandpa chuckled. "It's Christmas, boy. Open your gift." But before I could reply, the sound of the wind picked up outside, a low, mournful howl that made the house creak slightly. The snow had been falling steadily all evening, and now the windows were streaked with frost. The outside world obscured. It felt like we were completely isolated, wrapped in our own little bubble of warmth and light. Dad finally set the camera down, leaning back in his chair. "Well, if this thing's broken, I'll just take it to the shop tomorrow. No big deal." Mom returned to the couch. She pulled Ellie close, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "How's your snow globe?" "It's cool," Ellie said, holding it up. "But there's something weird about the picture inside. I can't see it properly." Grandma's music box clicked as it wound down, the melody fading into silence. She closed the lid gently, her hands lingering on its dark wood surface. "Well, whatever it is," she said softly, "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." For a while we all sat there, the fire crackling and the room filled with quiet conversation. It was easy to pretend that everything was normal, that nothing strange had happened. The festive atmosphere, fragile as it was, shattered shortly after dinner. Mom had just finished clearing the dishes when Grandpa excused himself to use the bathroom. None of us thought much of it at first. He was old, and sometimes he took his time. But as the minutes dragged on, an uneasy silence settled over the house. "I'll check on him," I offered, standing up. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. With each step down the dimly lit hallway, the sense of dread grew heavier. The door to the bathroom was half open, the faint glow of the hallway light reflecting on the tiled floor inside. I hesitated at the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. For a long moment I stood there, rooted to the spot. I wanted to call out to him, but the words wouldn't come. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a deafening thud in the silence. I glanced at my watch. 10:59 p.m. 3 minutes had passed since I'd left the living room, but it felt like an eternity. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The sight before me made my stomach lurch. Grandpa was slumped on the toilet. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were missing, the sockets hollow and dark, and his chest was hollowed out, as though his organs had been surgically removed. Blood pooled beneath him, the metallic scent so strong it made me gag. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the gruesome scene in front of me said otherwise. Grandpa was gone, and the precision of his mutilation sent a cold chill down my spine. I bolted back to the living room. My breath was ragged and my vision was blurred with tears. Grandpa's... I couldn't finish the sentence. The words were choking in my throat. Mom and Dad looked at me, their faces filled with alarm. "What? What happened?" Mom demanded, grabbing my arm. "He's dead," I managed to croak. "In the bathroom. He's dead." Dad didn't wait for more. He rushed past me toward the hallway, Mom following close behind. Ellie clung to my side. Her face was pale and stricken with fear. Grandma remained seated, clutching her music box, the haunting melody continuing to play in the oppressive silence. The house was suffocatingly quiet after the discovery of Grandpa's body. We had tried calling the police immediately, and though the line connected, they said the storm was causing delays, and no officers could reach us quickly. They promised to send someone, but their words felt distant, like a hollow assurance in the face of what was happening. It was as if the storm outside had swallowed all connections to the outside world. None of us dared to speak, as Dad and Mom dragged his lifeless form away from the stairs and covered him with a blanket. The weight of what had happened pressed down on all of us, making every movement feel like wading through thick mud. "We need to leave," Dad said, his voice low but firm. Whatever, whoever, did this could still be here. "In this storm?" Grandma asked, her hands trembling as she clutched the music box tighter. "We'd never make it. We're safer here." Dad didn't argue, but the tension in his jaw said he wasn't convinced. He stood by the window, peering out into the swirling snow. The darkness outside seemed alive, pressing against the glass like it wanted to get in. Ellie hadn't stopped crying since she saw Grandpa's body. She sat curled up on the couch, clutching her snow globe to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "It doesn't make sense," Mom whispered, sitting at the dining table. Her cutting board lay in front of her, forgotten but somehow ominous in its stillness. How could this happen? We were right here. We would have heard something. No one had an answer. I sat in the corner of the living room, gripping my unopened gift. It felt heavier now, like it was mocking me for leaving it untouched. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Who was doing this? Why? And how had they moved so silently? The sound of the wind outside grew louder, almost deafening, and the lights flickered again. Ellie let out a small yelp, and Dad turned sharply from the window. "Everyone stay together," he said. "No one goes anywhere alone." "Do you think it was him?" Ellie asked in a trembling voice, her eyes wide and fearful. "Who?" Mom asked gently, kneeling in front of her. "The guy in the Santa suit," Ellie whispered. Her words sent a chill through the room, though none of us wanted to admit it. We had all been thinking the same thing. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash came from the kitchen. The sound shattered the fragile calm, sending us all to our feet. Dad grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the sound, motioning for the rest of us to stay put. "Wait!" Mom called out. But Dad was already gone, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. The seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. Every creak of the house made my heart race. The snow globe in Ellie's hands clinked softly as she shook, the tiny flakes inside swirling like a storm. Then we heard him scream. It wasn't like the sound we had imagined Grandpa would make, guttural and full of terror. This one was different, anguished, agonized. It was followed by another sound, the unmistakable roar of fire. "Dad!" I yelled, bolting toward the hallway. Mom grabbed my arm, but I shook her off and ran toward the kitchen. The smell of smoke hit me before I saw him. Flames licked the edges of the doorway, casting a flickering orange glow across the walls. And there he was. Dad stood in the center of the room, engulfed in fire. His body writhed, his mouth open in a silent scream as the flames consumed him. The sight was horrifying, like something out of a nightmare. I froze, unable to move, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Mom and Ellie appeared behind me, and Mom screamed. "We have to do something," she cried, rushing toward the fire. She grabbed a blanket from the kitchen chair and began beating at the flames, but it was no use. They clung to him, burning hotter and brighter with every second. Ellie was sobbing uncontrollably, her snow globe slipping from her hands and shattering on the floor. I finally snapped out of my daze and grabbed a pitcher of water from the counter, throwing it over the fire. Mom joined in, grabbing anything she could find to smother the flames. When the fire finally died down, it was too late. Dad's body crumpled to the floor, blackened and still. The smell of burned flesh filled the air, making my stomach turn. His lifeless eyes stared up at us, unseeing. Beside him, the camera he had unwrapped earlier was smashed, its lens shattered. But the photo that had been inside it was now pinned to the wall with a knife. The image of the dining table with 6 chairs was clearer now, and the chair at the head of the table, Dad's chair, was fully engulfed in flames. I stumbled backward, tripping over the flashlight. The light spun wildly, illuminating the grotesque scene in flashes. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Mom collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Ellie clung to her, trembling violently. I stood there, numb, the horror of what had just happened sinking in like a cold weight in my chest. "We need to get out of here," I finally whispered, my voice shaking as I forced the words out. "Now." The air in the house was oppressive, thick with the lingering smell of burned flesh and smoke. Mom had pulled Ellie to the couch, wrapping her in a blanket as she shivered and cried. I paced the room, unable to sit still. Every corner of the house felt alive with shadows, every creak of the floorboards sending a fresh wave of anxiety through me. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We can't just stay here." Mom looked up at me, her face pale and drawn. "We have no choice. The storm and the police." Her voice trailed off. She didn't have to finish. We all knew help wasn't coming anytime soon. Grandma sat in her chair, holding her music box tightly in her lap. Her fingers traced the edges of the disfigured figurine inside, over and over again, as if the motion would ward off the growing terror. "We stick together," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "No one goes anywhere alone." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and masking any sound beyond the house. The lights flickered again, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I caught Ellie staring at one of the walls, her eyes wide and fixed. "What is it?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She pointed a trembling finger. There was something there, by the stairs. I followed her gaze, but the only thing I saw was the faint outline of the staircase in the dim light. "You're just scared," I said, though the words felt hollow. I wanted to believe them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. "It's this house," Mom whispered, more to herself than to us. "It's wrong." A sudden knock at the front door made us all jump. The sound was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the suffocating quiet. For a moment, no one moved. We exchanged glances, our fear mirrored in each other's eyes. "Who would be out there?" Grandma asked, her voice barely audible. Dad's warning echoed in my mind. Stay together. No one goes anywhere alone. But someone had to check. I swallowed hard and moved toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. "Be careful," Mom called out, her voice tight with fear. I approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The knocking came again, louder this time. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and I hesitated. Finally, I opened the door just a crack, the icy wind immediately biting at my face. No one was there. The porch was empty, blanketed in thick snow. The only movement came from the storm, the wind whipping snow into swirling patterns. I stepped back, my breath visible in the freezing air, and closed the door. "No one," I said, turning to the others. "It's empty." Mom shook her head, pulling Ellie closer. "We can't stay here." "And go where?" Grandma snapped, her fear bubbling into frustration. Into the storm? We'll freeze before we make it anywhere. We need to figure out what's happening, I said. We need to. The sound of footsteps upstairs stopped me mid-sentence. They were slow and deliberate, each creak of the floorboards above us making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We all froze, our eyes fixed on the ceiling. "No one's upstairs," Mom whispered, her voice trembling. "No one's supposed to be upstairs." The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I picked up the flashlight from the floor, gripping it tightly. "I'm going to check." "No," Mom said sharply, standing up. "We stick together, remember?" We gathered in the hallway, the light from the flashlight casting long shadows as I led the way to the staircase. The house seemed to hold its breath as we ascended, each step groaning under our weight. At the top of the stairs, the air was colder, as if the storm outside had seeped into the walls. The hallway stretched out before us. I moved toward the first door on the left, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The room was empty, untouched, just as we had left it. One by one, we checked the remaining rooms, but there was no sign of anyone. "It's nothing," Grandma said, her voice a mixture of relief and fear. "It's just this old house creaking in the wind." But as we turned to head back downstairs, the faint sound of the music box playing again drifted up from below. My blood ran cold as I realized Grandma had left it on the couch. "How is it playing?" Ellie whispered, clutching Mom's hand. No one answered. We descended the stairs together, the music growing louder with each step. The living room was just as we had left it, the couch empty except for the music box, its lid open and the disfigured figurine spinning slowly. I reached out to close it, but as my hand neared the box, the music stopped abruptly, leaving only the howling wind outside. We stared at one another, the silence pressing down on us. Whatever was happening, it wasn't done with us yet. The music box's silence left an oppressive void, as if the house itself had exhaled a long, chilling breath. We stood frozen in the dim glow of the flickering light, our eyes darting between the ominous music box and one another. No one dared to speak. "Let's get back upstairs," Mom whispered finally, her voice trembling. "We'll be safer together in a locked room." I nodded, leaving the music box untouched where it sat. Its weight felt heavier than before, the disfigured figurine staring up at me like a twisted warning. We turned and moved as a group, our steps careful and hurried as we climbed the stairs. Halfway up, the lights flickered once more and then went out completely. Ellie let out a stifled cry, clinging to Mom as the darkness swallowed us whole. "Keep moving," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "Don't stop." The air felt thicker now, every step a struggle as the storm outside howled louder. We stumbled into my room, slamming the door behind us and locking it with trembling hands. "What do we do now?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. She huddled next to Mom, who wrapped an arm around her protectively. "We wait for the lights," I said, leaning against the door. The words felt hollow, a desperate attempt to give us something to cling to. "They'll come back on soon." Grandma, silent through the chaos, shuffled to the armchair by the window and sank into it. Her silhouette was barely visible against the faint glow of the storm outside. The wind rattled the panes, casting moving shadows across the walls. Her hands rested on her lap, and for a moment, It almost felt calm. Minutes ticked by, though it felt like hours. The three of us sat in front of the door, barricading it with our bodies as the oppressive darkness pressed in. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind sent fresh waves of terror through us. "We can't stay here forever," Mom murmured. "We have to find a way to escape, to get help." "And go where?" I asked. "You saw what happened to Dad. We can't risk—" My voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Then we wait," Ellie said quietly, her voice trembling. "We wait for the police. They'll come. They have to." The lights flickered back on suddenly, the brightness blinding after so much time in the dark. We blinked, adjusting to the harsh glow. For a brief moment, relief washed over us. "Finally," Mom said. "At least we can see." Her voice trailed off as Ellie and I turned to look at Grandma. She was still in the chair, her head tilted to the side as if she were simply resting. But something was wrong. Her face was mutilated, the skin torn and disfigured in a grotesque, almost deliberate pattern. Her lifeless eyes stared ahead, unseeing, as blood dripped slowly down her chin and onto her lap. "Grandma?" Ellie whimpered, her voice breaking. Mom screamed, scrambling away from the chair and covering her mouth with her hands. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. Ellie began to sob, burying her face in Mom's shoulder. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking as I approached the chair. The music box clicked and stopped abruptly as I reached out to close it. The silence it left behind more deafening than the tune itself. This isn't real," I muttered, stepping back. But it was. It was all too real. The room felt heavy with silence, broken only by Ellie's soft sobs. We had wrapped Grandma's mutilated body in a sheet and laid her gently on the bed. None of us spoke as we worked, our hands trembling, our breaths ragged. The sight of her lifeless form, hidden beneath the white sheet, would haunt me forever. Mom wiped a tear from her cheek, her movements slow and mechanical. "We need to figure out what's happening," she said. "We can't just stay here. We have to." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I moved to the window, desperate for a distraction, for something to ground me. The storm outside was relentless, the wind whipping snow into chaotic swirls that obscured everything beyond the yard. But then I saw it. A figure stood in the snow, tall and broad, clad in red, the Santa Claus. His face was hidden beneath the hood of his suit, but I could feel his gaze, cold and piercing, locked on me. My stomach churned as I noticed the sack lying on the ground in the snow. It lay motionless, pale and limp, as if death had frozen it in place. Then I saw it, a hand, pale and limp, protruding from the opening of the bag. "Mom, come here," I whispered, my voice trembling. She joined me at the window, her face blanching as she followed my gaze. "Is he—" She started, her voice barely audible. "He's staring right at us," I said. "And there's a hand in the bag." Ellie joined us, her face pale as she peered out. What is he doing?" The Santa didn't move for a long moment. Then, in a blur, he turned and sprinted toward the house with inhuman speed. His limbs moved unnaturally, almost like a predator on all fours, his wide frame barreling through the snow without effort. "He's coming!" Mom screamed, pulling us back from the window. My hands shook as I pressed against the door. The sound of the front door slamming open echoed through the house, followed by the rapid, thunderous sound of footsteps pounding against the floor. "It sounds like he's running on all fours," Ellie whimpered. The footsteps grew louder, impossibly fast, like a stampede heading straight for us. Each impact rattled the floor beneath us, shaking the room. Mom cried. We pressed harder against the door, our bodies forming a desperate barricade. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, pausing for a single, agonizing second before thundering toward the room. I gripped the flashlight in my trembling hands. "He can't get in," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. We locked the door. "He can't get in." The doorknob rattled violently, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. We held our breaths, straining to hear any sound, any sign of movement. A low, guttural laugh echoed from the other side of the door. It was deep, unnatural, and sent a shiver down my spine. The door shook as something heavy slammed against it. Once, twice, 3 times. Then everything went quiet again. "Is he gone?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us answered. We stayed pressed against the door, listening to the storm outside and the deafening silence within. But deep down, I knew he wasn't gone. He was still out there, waiting. The silence pressed down on us like a physical weight. None of us dared to move, our ears straining for the faintest sound. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time felt meaningless in the oppressive dark. Ellie clutched Mom tightly, her breathing shallow and quick. "He's still there," she whispered. "I know he is." Mom nodded, though she said nothing. Her hand rested on Ellie's head, a small act of comfort in an otherwise terrifying moment. I sat with my back against the door, the flashlight gripped tightly in my hand, ready to turn it on at the first sign of movement. Then out of the silence, the music box began to play. The haunting melody crept into the room, each distorted note scraping against my nerves. My stomach turned as I realized the sound was coming from inside. Slowly, I turned my head toward the desk. There it was, Grandma's music box. The lid was open, the disfigured figurine spinning slowly. But how? We had left it downstairs. No one had touched it. "Mom," I said. "Look." She turned her head, and when her eyes landed on the music box, her face went pale. "What? How did that get here?" "It was downstairs," Ellie whispered, shaking her head furiously. "We left it downstairs." The melody continued, growing louder and more warped with each rotation of the figurine. The air in the room felt colder, heavier, as if the music itself was alive, pressing down on us. "We have to get rid of it," Mom said suddenly. "Throw it out. Now." I didn't hesitate. I stood and grabbed the music box, its weight feeling unnatural in my hands. The figurine continued to spin, its mutilated face a frozen mask of horror. The melody seemed to shift, growing more chaotic, more insistent, as if it knew what I was about to do. I rushed to the window and flung it open. The freezing wind roared into the room, biting at my skin. Without a second thought, I hurled the music box into the storm. It vanished into the swirling snow, the melody cutting off abruptly as it disappeared. I slammed the window shut and locked it. For a moment, the room was silent again. The oppressive weight lifted, if only slightly. "Is it gone?" Ellie asked, her voice small. "It's gone," I said, turning back to them. "It's over." But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. The silence felt wrong, like the house itself was holding its breath. Mom and Ellie huddled together, their eyes darting to the window as if expecting something to appear. And then, faintly from somewhere outside, the melody began to play again. It was distant, almost lost in the howling wind. But it was there. The disjointed notes carried through the storm, a chilling reminder that whatever was tormenting us wasn't done yet. The melody faded into the night, leaving behind an unbearable silence. We sat frozen, the faint sound of the wind outside the only reminder that the world still existed beyond these walls. None of us dared to speak. None of us dared to move. Then the sound of cracking filled the room. It was faint at first, like ice shifting under pressure. Ellie's head shot up, her wide eyes darting to the door. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all listened, the sound growing louder. It wasn't ice. It wasn't the storm. It was wood. The door frame was splintering. The doorknob rattled, a soft metallic click echoing through the room. I pressed my back harder against the door, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. And then it stopped. The cracking ceased, and the doorknob was still. My heart thundered in my chest as the silence stretched on, suffocating and endless. Suddenly the door opened. There was no violent burst, no splintering of wood or shattering of the barricade. It simply swung inward, as if it had never been locked, as if we hadn't pressed our weight against it for hours. The hallway beyond was empty. The dim light from the storm outside cast long shadows that danced along the walls. But we knew better. We knew he was there. "Get back," Mom hissed, pulling Ellie close to her. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and held it up like a weapon. I stood, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the open doorway. The air was colder now, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and froze your blood. And then he appeared. Santa Claus stepped into the doorway, his massive frame filling the space. His red suit was pristine, but his face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. The faint glint of his eyes, cold and predatory, sent a shiver down my spine. Behind him, the sack from outside now lay slumped on the floor, its opening just visible. The pale hand from before was gone, replaced by a void that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision. "Stay back," Mom shouted. She swung the lamp, but the towering figure didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply stood there, his presence more oppressive than any sound. Ellie whimpered, burying her face in Mom's side. I felt my legs shake, the flashlight slipping slightly in my grip. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if his mere presence consumed everything around him. Without warning, Santa tilted his head slightly, the motion slow and deliberate. Then he stepped forward, the wooden floor groaning under his weight. Each step was measured, each one echoing like a death knell. "Up on the bed," Mom whispered, her voice shaking. "Now." Ellie and I scrambled onto the bed, our backs pressed against the wall. Mom stood between us and the figure, the lamp held high, though it seemed laughably small in the face of such a presence. Santa stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there, his head tilting again as if observing us. Then, in a horrifying blur, he lunged forward, grabbing Mom with one massive hand. "Run!" Mom screamed, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped, pressed against the wall as the nightmare unfolded in front of us. Santa threw the lamp aside, his grip unyielding as he dragged Mom to the center of the room. She kicked and struggled, but it was no use. With an almost deliberate precision, he pulled out a sharp, glinting tool, a knife that shimmered even in the dim light. "No!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I tried to move, but fear rooted me in place. Ellie screamed, clutching my arm as tears streamed down her face. Santa lowered the blade to Mom's chest, carving with an unsettling calm. The floral pattern from her cutting board appeared, etched into her flesh with cruel precision. Blood flowed freely, staining the floor beneath her as she gasped in pain. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice hoarse, but he didn't stop. He didn't even look at us. His focus was singular, his movements methodical. The carving was slow, deliberate, a grotesque mimicry of art. Mom's cries faded into choked gasps, her strength ebbing away. I watched in horror, the sight of Santa's blade carving into her chest, etched into my mind like a scar. Blood pooled around her, and the floral pattern took shape, grotesque and mocking. Ellie gripped my arm tightly. Her voice cracked as she screamed. Her desperation jolted me out of my frozen terror. "Go," I said, grabbing Ellie's hand. Together, we leapt off the bed and dashed past Santa's hulking frame. His head tilted sharply toward us, but he didn't move, his focus still on Mom. His hand held her limp form in place as his blade continued its monstrous work. Ellie and I tore through the doorway and sprinted down the stairs, the sound of our frantic footsteps echoing through the house. Behind us, the scraping sound of Santa's sack against the floor followed, mingling with Mom's fading cries. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't dare stop. We stumbled into the living room, gasping for breath, the adrenaline pounding through my veins, making everything feel surreal. Ellie collapsed onto the rug, clutching her chest, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting Santa to materialize from the shadows. "What now?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat on her pale cheeks. I glanced at the front door, locked and bolted. The storm outside made escape impossible, the snow hammering against the windows like a taunt. The snowstorm was so heavy that even opening the door would mean facing blinding, freezing winds and being buried in moments. My mind raced for answers, for anything we could do to stop this nightmare. We just need to stay together, I said, though the words felt hollow. We'll find a way out. Ellie wiped her tears, her gaze shifting to the shattered remains of her snow globe lying near the corner of the room. She crawled toward it, picking up a large shard of glass with trembling hands. "Ellie, don't," I said, moving toward her. "It's broken. Leave it." But she shook her head, her eyes fixed on something inside the remnants of the globe. "There's a picture," she whispered. "I saw it before, but now it's clear." She reached into the shards and pulled out a small, damp photo that had been hidden within the base of the snow globe. Her hands shook as she held it up to the faint light from the storm. I leaned closer, squinting at the image. It was a girl, no older than 10, hanging from a rope tied to a gnarled tree. Her eyes were missing, her face pale and lifeless. The photograph was grainy, but the gruesome details were unmistakable. Ellie's breath hitched. It's her. It's the girl in the snow globe. What girl? I asked, my stomach sinking. I told you, she said, her voice trembling. When I first got it, I saw something inside. I thought it was just part of the design. But this... She trailed off, staring at the photo as if it might come to life. We need to throw that away. Now, I said, my voice firm. Ellie hesitated, her grip on the photo tightening. It's connected, she whispered. This is part of what's happening. It's why he's here. Ellie, I said, kneeling beside her. We can't let this thing stay with us. It's dangerous. Please just let it go. Before she could respond, a deep, guttural laugh echoed from somewhere upstairs. It was faint but unmistakable, a sound that sent ice through my veins. Ellie dropped the photo, her face blanching as she scrambled back toward me. He's coming, she whimpered. He's coming back. I grabbed the photo from the floor and shoved it into my pocket. We have to keep moving, I said, pulling Ellie to her feet. Come on, we can't stay here. Together we moved toward the kitchen, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of our hurried steps. The house seemed to breathe around us, the creaks and groans of the old wood amplifying the tension. Every shadow felt alive, every corner a potential hiding place for the monster stalking us. We reached the kitchen, the dim light from the storm outside filtering through the frost-covered windows. The air was colder here, almost unnaturally so, and each exhale left clouds of mist that hung in the air like ghosts. Ellie stayed close to me, her hand gripping the back of my shirt as we edged through the room. We need to find something to block the door, I said, my voice barely a whisper. My eyes scanned the counters and drawers for anything heavy, anything that will keep him out. Ellie nodded mutely, her face pale, and began rifling through a drawer filled with useless odds and ends. The low groan of the house settling made both of us freeze for a moment. Every sound felt like a harbinger of something worse. Then it came, a crash from the living room. The sound of wood splintering and heavy, deliberate footsteps sent a jolt of terror through me. He was inside. I grabbed Ellie's hand, and we bolted toward the back hallway. The sound of heavy footsteps and the relentless dragging of something heavy echoed behind us. My mind raced for an escape route, but the twisting corridors of the old house seemed to close in, narrowing with every turn. As we reached the back hallway, the sound of crashing came again, louder and closer. The narrow passage suddenly felt suffocating, and without warning, I stumbled and dropped the flashlight I was holding. It clattered to the ground and rolled out of reach, leaving us in complete darkness. Keep going, I hissed, gripping Ellie's hand tightly in the dark. But as we moved forward, the hallway split into two directions. In the pitch black, I hesitated, unsure which path to take. Before I could decide, another crash echoed from behind us, shaking the walls. In the confusion, Ellie's hand slipped from mine. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no choice. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps was closing in, forcing me to move. I turned and sprinted down the opposite hallway, my heart pounding in my chest as the darkness pressed around me. The house was silent now, except for the faint sound of my own breath and the distant creaks of the old wood. I slowed to a stop, straining my ears for any sign of Ellie or him, but there was nothing. Desperate for cover, I spotted a small closet door slightly ajar. Without hesitation, I slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could. The space was cramped, filled with coats and the faint smell of mothballs. I crouched low, holding my breath, my hands trembling as I pressed them against my knees. The silence was worse than the noise. It felt alive, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. My breaths came shallow and quick, each one louder than the last in the oppressive quiet. Every creak of the house outside felt magnified, each groan of the wood making my heart race. Somewhere in the house, I thought I heard a faint noise, a creak, a breath, or perhaps just my imagination. My heart raced as I realized how alone I was, and still the silence continued to grow, heavy and unbroken. Time lost all meaning. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Each second dragged endlessly, the silence wrapping around me tighter with every breath. My legs cramped, my back ached, but I didn't dare move. Movement felt dangerous, as if even the slightest shift might betray my presence. The air grew stale, thick with the mingling sense of mothballs and fear. My breaths were shallow, measured, each one an effort to remain as quiet as possible. Outside the closet, the house was still. No creaks, no footsteps, no dragging sounds. Just silence. I pressed my forehead against my knees, squeezing my eyes shut. My mind raced with thoughts of Ellie. Was she safe? Was she hiding too? Or worse? I shook the thought away before it could take root. My heartbeat became my only companion, a relentless drum that seemed loud enough to fill the entire house. I clutched my knees tighter, my hands damp with sweat. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of me screamed to run, to break free from the suffocating stillness. But I stayed. The darkness remained unbroken, the silence uninterrupted. And still, I sat waiting for something, anything, to happen. The thought crept in slowly at first, like a faint whisper in the back of my mind. Then it grew louder, heavier, until it was unbearable. I had lost everyone. Mom, Dad, Grandpa, Grandma. They were all gone. On a day I had looked forward to the most, the day I thought would be filled with joy and laughter. My entire world had been taken from me. And Ellie. The thought of her alone in this nightmare was like a knife twisting in my chest. If she was still alive, she was terrified. She needed me. I couldn't stay here, hiding in the dark, waiting for the inevitable. If I was going to die, I would rather it happen trying to save her. I took a shaky breath and slowly unfolded myself, my cramped muscles protesting as I moved. The coats brushed against my shoulders, but I ignored the sensation, focusing instead on what I had to do. "Get up," I whispered to myself, the words barely audible. "You can't stay here." I reached for the closet door, my fingers trembling as they found the edge. The house was still silent, the oppressive quiet pressing down on me. I hesitated, my heart racing, but I forced myself to push the door open just enough to slip out. The hallway was pitch black. I shuffled forward cautiously, my hands outstretched to guide me. The floor creaked beneath my weight, each sound like a gunshot in the stillness. I was moving blind, every step a leap of faith. Then my foot hit something solid. I froze, the sudden contact sending a jolt of fear through me. I crouched down, my hands searching the floor until they found it. The flashlight I had dropped earlier. Relief flooded through me as I picked it up, the familiar weight grounding me. My fingers found the switch, and with a click, the beam of light cut through the darkness. It was faint, the battery nearly dead, but it was enough to illuminate the immediate area around me. "Ellie," I whispered, clutching the flashlight tightly. The silence didn't respond, but I didn't care. I had made my decision. I was going to find her, even if it killed me. The flashlight's faint beam wavered as I moved through the dark, every step accompanied by the groaning protests of the old floorboards. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound almost deafening in the suffocating silence of the house. I swept the light across the walls, the peeling wallpaper and faded portraits staring back at me like ghosts. The beam trembled, illuminating nothing but the empty, yawning shadows of the hallway ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the darkness itself was trying to pull me back. "Ellie?" I whispered, my voice shaking. It barely rose above the stillness, swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive air around me. The faint creak of something above me made me stop in my tracks. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter as I slowly tilted my head up. The light followed, cutting through the shadows like a trembling knife. There she was. Ellie's small body hung lifelessly from a rope tied to the exposed beam of the ceiling. Her feet dangled inches above the floor, swaying ever so slightly, as if moved by an unseen breeze. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, her eyes wide open but unseeing. The faint beam of the flashlight illuminated her face, pale and haunting, her expression frozen in a grimace of terror. "No!" I choked, the word catching in my throat. My legs gave out, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking violently in my hand. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes and block out the image burned into my mind. But I couldn't. My gaze was locked on her, on the horror etched into every inch of her lifeless form. The sound of the rope creaking with her gentle sway filled the air, a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent chills down my spine. The flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before returning. It cast Ellie's shadow long and twisted against the wall, a grotesque mockery of her small frame. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of what I was seeing. My chest heaved, each breath a struggle as despair clawed at me from every angle. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her down, but my body wouldn't move. My limbs felt like lead, pinned by an invisible weight. All I could do was sit there, the faint light of the flashlight flickering over her lifeless body. The silence around me deepened, broken only by the faint creak of the rope. My trembling hand moved to my pocket, pulling out the photo I had found earlier, the one of the girl hanging from the tree. I held it up in the flickering light, expecting to see the familiar haunting image. But my breath hitched, and a new wave of horror consumed me. The girl in the photo was no longer a stranger. It was Ellie. Her lifeless eyes stared back at me from the grainy image, the same expression of terror frozen on her face as the body that hung before me. My hand shook violently, and the photo slipped from my grasp, fluttering to the ground. The image was burned into my mind, merging with the horrifying reality in front of me. And still, I couldn't look away. The blinding brightness of the lights coming on felt like a jolt to my senses. For a moment, I was paralyzed, squinting against the sudden illumination. The oppressive darkness that had cloaked the house was gone, replaced by the sterile glare of every light in the house. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The realization hit me slowly. The police were here. Help had finally arrived. Relief washed over me, dull and fleeting, as the nightmare I had endured seemed to relent for the first time. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house. The creak of the front door being forced open reverberated like a thunderclap. Voices followed, clear and commanding, but they sounded muffled, distant. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to summon the energy to move or respond. "Anyone here?" a voice called out. I stumbled into the hallway, the flashlight hanging loosely in my hand. 2 officers appeared around the corner, their faces taut with concern. Their eyes scanned the scene, taking in my disheveled state, the blood on my clothes. The sheer terror etched into my expression. "You're safe now," one of them said, his tone firm but reassuring. "We'll take care of everything." I wanted to speak, to tell them everything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I pointed numbly toward the room where Ellie hung. Their expressions darkened as they moved past me, their footsteps heavy but purposeful. I remained in the hallway, dazed and trembling. My gaze drifted downward, landing on the one unopened gift beneath the tree. My gift, the only one that hadn't been touched. Something about it drew me closer. I moved toward the tree, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I knelt down, I saw it. A folded piece of paper tucked neatly beside the box. My shaking hands reached for it, unfolding it with agonizing slowness. The note was simple, the handwriting sharp and precise. It read, "See you next year."